So welcome folks to the People Prescription, the right dose of HR wisdom. Today we've got Sarah Toombs joining us. Nice to see you here today, Sarah. First and foremost, would you mind just introducing yourselves to our audience?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. So pleased for you to have the podcast and excited to be here. So I'm an accredited psychotherapist, psychological coach, and workplace wellbeing consultant. So I teach big-hearted high achievers and leaders how to swap self-doubt for more calm and confident. And then I collaborate with heart-led businesses to create bespoke workplace wellbeing solutions so their people and therefore their profits can thrive.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. And, in terms of sort of my role, so over the last 20 years working in human resources, my consultancy, Order Employment Services, our strapline is your partner for people and profits. And it's important that we reference people first because they are the engine that drives our employees in terms of their bottom line for a business, in terms of the mission that these companies are on that we support. So it's going to be great to go into today's topic, which is all about where HR meets psychology and well-being and the overlap that not everybody talks about. So it's going to be good to get into some of the areas that we're going to talk about today around overthinking, the hidden productivity drain that can come with that type of approach. Also looking at things like stress and burnout and trying to find that balance and understanding too the real cost to business leaders if they're always on. So it's going to be fantastic to explore those further with you. So I think perhaps a good place to start then would be the overthinking side of things. So as an organization, we do support people with measures, systems, processes to put in place to address workplace well-being. And a lot of the time it starts with a policy. But what I always suggest to our clients is that it's not only about the policy, it's about the people that sit behind it as well. And for me, as an organization, really what that's about is practicing what you preach within a policy. So a lot of the time when we talk about well-being and mind health, that can sit in two aspects of a business's duty of care. It could be the duty of care that they have as an employer for health and safety reasons, but also from a performance perspective, it's the duty of care that leaders have towards their teams to develop an environment where people can be incredibly productive. So it'd be useful today to talk a bit more really about your thoughts on how business leaders can be clear on the difference between, say, a healthy reflection and perhaps even also decision paralysis within their teams. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I was really listening intently to what you were sharing then. And my first thoughts are putting the people at the heart of the business. I loved what you said there. That absolutely aligns. And I think it's about putting people at the heart of the business. So yes, have the policies, yes, have the procedures. We need to know how that would fit into the workplace, but it needs to be all about the people, putting the people at the forefront. So that's so important.
Yeah. 100%. I think where it could be challenging, certainly when I've spoke to other leaders in the past, depending on the nature of the business that they're working on. For example, if it's an innovative company, say perhaps a startup, then leaders can sometimes think that slow equals careful when it comes to how people are reflecting on the decisions that are being made within teams. And it often just means potentially fear-based stagnation for some of them. So especially in a startup environment, what we tend to find is that the business owners, the people who are at the helm, they want to make decisions quickly so they can innovate, adapt. And for some of them, they view mistakes as a good thing because it shows that actually decisions are being made and that ultimately they're reaching their end goal. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the, first and foremost, the productivity piece, but also how they can potentially overcome those barriers of actually that healthy reflection balanced with perhaps being a little bit too careful or, getting into that sort of decision paralysis state?
Two thoughts are going through my mind. The first one is kind of addressing that overthinking. And then the second thought is the responsibility of leaders, the workplace, to create a culture where mistakes are healthy. It's okay to fail, and not making that a failure about the person, but looking at, okay, what are the opportunities here? So I think there's two definite sides to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the side I see quite a bit is where good leaders especially tend to focus on the subject rather than the person. So if they're sharing some feedback about they believe that perhaps a process was too slow or a decision wasn't made within a suitable amount of time, then they'll focus on the subject of the challenge rather than the individual person. So
Mm.
what they tend to do is sort of depersonalize it. What can sometimes happen for more inexperienced leaders is that they focus on the individual. Do you think there's any sort of mileage in that in terms of trying to build up a solid system or a good process for employees so it makes them a bit more confident and it allows them to thrive and make those timely decisions without constantly needing a sign off from their leader?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, focusing on the process and not the person. That's what's going through my mind when I'm listening to you speaking, and how effective and beneficial that is, because we're thinking about making things more effective. But then, secondly, I also think there's mileage in supporting the individual. So, thinking about what does that individual need in order to make decisions from a place of confidence. And I think that comes from kind of the culture that we input and embed into a workplace. If we're making it, okay to do that, we're kind of saying we're instilling trust into our people. That's when they're going to be able to make those decisions. The other thing is, we said we were going to talk about overthinking before, so I wonder if we
Yeah.
could steer back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, overthinking from a HR perspective often stems
Mm.
from unclear authority or perhaps that fear of getting something wrong. And from a leader's perspective, one of the things I try and encourage leaders to do initially is to really just set the scene and the foundation for what the task is. So being really clear on the instructions, the destination, but then ultimately, once that destination's been clearly communicated to the team, they allow the team to achieve that with full autonomy. And as you said there, trust, I think, is such an incredibly key part of a healthy team. And people understand that if they've been given that destination, they've been trained well in how to achieve the goal in their role, then it's a lot more likely that good decisions are going to be made along the way. But from an overthinking
Mm.
perspective, are there any themes and trends that you see from a psychologist perspective that can sometimes feed into that behavior of overthinking or getting lost in the details, shall we say?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Something that I see a lot with the people I work with, they tend to be what I call big hearted high achievers. So
Hmm.
people who really, really care, like just big hearts, really, really care. And
Hmm.
often with that, we get people pleasing traits or perfectionist traits
Right.
where we want everything to be perfect, we want everything to be right. And if that's what's going on, then sometimes kind of getting lost in that detail and therefore overthinking can kind of happen more easily and more
Yes.
often. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So, what kind of things would you suggest they do to try and sort of rebuild that in a healthy way?
Yeah, lovely question. The first thing that goes to my mind is to normalize that this is happening. So often, what I hear in the coaching that I do is people think that they're the only ones thinking this way. They
Mhm.
think they're the only ones who are overthinking. They think it's just them, and we can hold a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment. If we circle back to the workplace, at what we're talking about here, that
Yes.
can then cause more mistakes, more kind of tightening the grip, more getting lost in the detail.
Right.
So it kind of all links. And then definitely normalizing that. And I always say what's most personal is what's most universal. So
Hmm.
you're not alone. But then, secondly, there's absolutely things that we can do to manage the health of our mind. Because when we think about overthinking, all it is a kind of mental habit that we've continued to rehearse. We're kind
Right.
of like stuck in like a default mode
I'm
that
with you.
feels normal and natural, but we can actually train our brain just like we train our bodies.
Right. So, a bit like going to the gym then.
Yeah, definitely. Same as going to the gym. And that's the analogy that I would always use. So, exactly the same if we're thinking about we want to lift more weights in the gym. How
Hmm.
do we get stronger? How do we get physically stronger? We show up to the gym, we lift weights, we do repetitions. The same when we think about, I guess, mental fitness. That's what we're talking about. The same with mental fitness. It just comes with practice and consistently showing up to doing the exercises that support that calmer, clearer thinking.
So what would be the sort of the equivalent of a dumbbell then for these kind of activities? So I see this a lot with leaders where,
Mm.
especially with CEOs, people who've got a lot of responsibility, you tend to find the hierarchy of an organization, the more lonely it can be for the business leader themselves. And they don't always have, they're the person that's supposed to have all the answers. And they also have to, even if it's a particularly difficult period for them, whether it be emotionally, financially for the business, operationally, they still have to have this persona of confidence and knowing that, everything's going to be okay. And it can be sometimes quite challenging. Again, it's from a consultancy perspective when we go in. So we have a product called the HR Doctor at OES. And
Mm.
one of the things that we're there to do is to understand first. So we don't make any assumptions. We ask a huge amount of questions to begin with to establish actually what the challenge is to begin with. And the reason we do that is that we don't want to assume anything, because if we assume that it's something that where it isn't, that can be a huge challenge. At the
Mm.
same time, though, we do get feedback, especially when we're going through that initial discovery stage with a business owner, that perhaps they do feel like they're spinning too many plates at once, or they are getting into that sort of decision paralysis area where
Mm.
decisions aren't necessarily being made because they want more information or they need more detail. So what would you recommend there to sort of build that muscle a bit really in order to break through the decision paralysis or that overthinking process?
Yes. A couple of things are going through my mind listening to you speaking. The first thing, I think when people know why it works, that's a big part of this. So if we talk to that first and then we look at what we can do and the reps as such.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to something called kind of neuroplasticity in the brain. So this
Right.
is our kind of like ability to form new neural pathways. And we can leverage this when we're thinking about overcoming overthinking. We can focus on more positive, helpful thought patterns that are going to create that physical change in our brain.
Right.
So when we do those reps and when we do those practices, it kind of reduces that overthinking. And the more consistent we are with that, the more we can then make clear decisions, the more we can cope with pressure, the more kind of calm and confident we are. So I think really understanding that one, we can change these thought patterns.
Yeah.
We're not stuck in this like getting lost over detail. We can actually do something about it. I think instilling that hope, first of all, is like really key. And then if we take a look at things that we can do, I always say one of the things that we want to do is kind of send the body into the rest and digest response. So if you look at it from a psychology point of view, when we're kind of overthinking and when we're stressed and anxious, the body's gone into that fight and flight response. So we've got
Right.
cortisol, adrenaline pumping all the way through the body. We notice things like an increased heart rate, like our blood pressure rises, we get breathless, we get like a squelchy stomach,
Right.
all the physical signs and symptoms of stress that people know really well. We have the same physical response in our body as if you and I were sitting in our offices now and someone charged through the door like attacked us.
Right.
Same physical response in our body as if we were overthinking a decision at work or worried about an outcome. So our thoughts are that powerful that they can have that impact on our body. So what we want to do, really simple, underrated tool that we can definitely put in place first of all, is
Yeah.
focus on reps with breathing. So when
Right.
we breathe and we adopt certain breathing patterns, so maybe breathing in for the count of 4, a gentle pause, like holding, and then out for the count of 4. The science and the psychology says we only need to do that a minimum of 4 rounds of breath till the body gets the signal that, okay, we're okay. We can slow down, we can go back into rest and digest. So I think practicing grounding techniques frequently, not just when we're in the state of stress or
Mhm.
state of pressure, making them a part of every day is going to be a really helpful first step.
Absolutely. I think that's a classic way, like you say, through breathing and through grounding to really get to a place of composure rather than a place of stress. I mean, as you were
Mm.
saying that there, where you gave the analogy of somebody bursting through the office, I mean, immediately I was thinking of it like being chased by a tiger, and,
Yeah.
and what would I be doing if I'm being chased by a tiger? Well, I'll probably be breathing out a hell of a lot and panting and, and it would be quite panicky. So I think that aspect of just breathing out steadily and it could calm you down. It's the direct opposite. So you're almost kind of tricking the mind into thinking that you're in a safe space, which I suppose you are. It's the thoughts
Yes,
that are driving it that are actually making it incredibly difficult to find that place of composure. So that's I think
definitely.
a really useful tool that people can use. And it's something that we all do, isn't it? It can be quite subtle too. Would you say, Sarah? Is that something somebody could do even if they're just sat at the desk and working away?
Absolutely. We can do it anywhere. So listening to you talking now, I can just practice my breathing. I also say, let's pair it with the body. So feel your feet on the floor, kind of wriggle your toes in your shoes, feel your legs on the back of the chair. Like the more we can kind of get out of the brain that's overthinking and back into the body, the more we can kind of ground back into the moment. And it's so interesting. When you were speaking then, our thoughts are that powerful. It has that physical effect on the body. So when we're breathing, we're kind of not tricking our brain as such, because as you said, we are safe. We're not in any physical danger.
Mhm.
We're not being threatened. And I think even that positive self-talk in your mind of, okay, I'm safe, I'm okay, I'm here, that can also signal that same powerful message that the body can stand down then. I sometimes use the analogy of the guards at Buckingham Palace that like
Yeah.
standing to attention on guard. That's what's happening in the body with that adrenaline and cortisol. If we can kind of calm the body through breathing, through that positive self-talk in our mind, the guards are like, okay, let's settle again. We're safe. It's okay. So I think practicing those grounding techniques anywhere, we can do them walking the dog, we can do them in meetings, we can do them in the car. So accessible, but so powerful and so simple that people often overlook those basic things.
I think as well, though, I'm a big believer
Yeah.
that there's a huge power in simplicity because those simple techniques, I think, demonstrate somebody's ownership of a particular topic as well.
Yes.
Because I think what can happen occasionally, especially in business to business or from a consultancy perspective, there
Mm.
are providers out there that can sometimes hide behind big words, and I think the simplicity of being able to share something that is actually very powerful, it adds an aspect of trust with teams as well, that they understand that actually, yeah, I can do this, and they can take ownership of that process to hopefully put them in a much better place to make those decisions in the first place and not go into that spiral of overthinking. So,
Yes.
I mean, from a
Yeah.
leadership perspective, I think that's definitely something that would you say, or would you recommend that that's perhaps promoted by line managers to their team, that the people that they're leading to encourage that sort of stillness of mind?
Yes, definitely. I think role modeling, if we can role model the fact that you do that and find value, we're kind of leading the way for other people.
Yeah.
And I think definitely doing that. And there's something about when you were speaking before about that spiraling of the mind. I just
Mhm.
wanted to talk to that point for a moment, just so we
Yeah,
can
excellent.
equip people listening with like another really helpful tool. So when we're thinking about training our mind, we're thinking about this idea that we are not the thoughts that we think. So it might be a strange concept to start thinking about, but
Right.
in actual fact, we are the watcher of our thoughts. So what we want to start doing is creating that like distinction. So
Hmm.
rather than getting swept up in that constant rumination, overthinking, those unhelpful thinking patterns, like take a breath is always the first step. Send your
Hmm.
body into that rest and digest. And then when we do that, we bring our logical brain back online and we can start
Right.
to analyze the thoughts that we're thinking, create that distinction and start to think, okay, what is this thought? So I'm not the thought getting caught up in that. I'm the one that's kind of watching the thought. I
Hmm.
often think about it as the analogy of we're kind of at a crossroads.
Right.
We can either go left, and that might be catastrophizing, we've gone in a really unhelpful direction we don't want to go in, or
Hmm.
we can go left, we can start choosing the thoughts we think that are going to support the outcome that we want. We
Right.
want to try and catch ourselves when we're at that point where we can kind of notice what's happening from a really curious lens, being really curious about what is happening, paying attention before we enter that loop of excessive thinking.
So if somebody's in that state, I know you said
Mm.
about detachment and understanding that the thoughts are not necessarily facts, that you need to verify what's being said. But
Yes.
how would they verify that? Is it a case of you are going over a particular aspect of your thinking that is recurring but not necessarily verified? how would somebody overcome, what would be one of your best tools to look at verification? I mean, how would somebody address that?
Yeah, good question. I've got two I'd love to share. So the first one is taking your thoughts to court. So pretending you're like a lawyer that's
Right.
presenting this as evidence to the courtroom. So we
Mhm.
want to say, like, where's the evidence for this thought? Is it a fact or is it just an opinion? Is it a perception that I have that I'm making up that isn't based on any fact? So I think taking your thoughts to court in a way and asking yourself, where are the facts, and anchoring back into the facts. So important and so helpful, because often so much of the thoughts that we get stuck in are just made up. They're like worst
Yes.
case scenarios made
Yeah.
up, right? So that's definitely something I would say a really helpful tool. And then the second thing that leads on from that is the 3 filter framework.
Right.
So filter one is, if this is a thought I'm thinking, what's the worst case scenario here? So
Hmm.
often when we're trapped in those unhelpful thinking loops, it's all fear based and we can
Right.
kind of be a bit blinkered and ignore them. But if we allow ourselves to go there with courage, we can actually play it through in our mind and think, what's the worst case scenario? And then if that actual thing happened, how would I handle it?
I'm with you.
So we start to become more prepared and we can think of our own actions. Filter two, what's the best case scenario that can happen here? And how would we feel about that? So beginning to present a new reality into our mind. And then filter three, what's the most likely outcome? Usually it's not the fear. Usually it's kind of something that actually is likely to happen that we can then anchor back into,
Right.
usually based on kind of the facts of the situation that we looked at before.
Yeah, it's
So,
interesting. Yeah. One of the things that I do say to a lot of business
mm,
leaders is that, courage is choosing what matters over fear. And
mm,
yeah, I use the analogy a lot of, if somebody's driving down a snowy lane, it might seem counterintuitive that if you lose control of the vehicle, to turn into the skid will actually allow you to control the vehicle a lot more in a much more measured way.
mm,
And even though, and it's the same with people challenges, you might be coming across a people challenge that you're not necessarily confident in dealing with, or you wish to turn into the skid, to use that analogy, and to address it head on. But actually choosing what matters over the fear of perhaps a conflict or pushback from that particular employee, it allows them to achieve their objectives a lot more solidly in a much shorter period of time as well. So, time's of the essence in a lot of businesses.
I love that. Brené Brown talks about courageous leadership and she talks about choosing what's right and almost doing the hard thing, leaning into that, taking that courageous leadership, even when we might not want to, but doing what's right and leaning into that.
So I'd be curious to understand
Mm,
your opinion, really, your recommendations for, if you've got perhaps, say, a line manager, how can we give managers the tools to spot when perhaps perfectionism, or even it could even be avoidance in disguise. We do see, or I see this a lot, where it's a classic disguise of people are not necessarily comfortable making decisions through either fear of failure, or
mm.
there's perhaps a low self-esteem concern there as well. So, to give people the confidence, from a leader's perspective, to give their team and direct reports the confidence to feel comfortable making those kind of decisions, or even to role play it in a safe environment, which again, I think is an incredible way to do it. The training
Mm.
that can be offered to leaders and line managers in how to manage conflict in the workplace, as an example. But coming back to this overthinking, what would be some of the things that you'd be looking for to spot? Is it actually perhaps avoidance in disguise, or is that person a bit of a perfectionist where they're not necessarily making the decision when it needs to be made because they're trying to get it perfect?
Yes, yeah, all those things. So I think, first of all, getting to know your people, actually showing an interest, getting to know your people, and
Mhm.
knowing that this might show up differently for different members of your team.
Right.
So there are some similarities, as you were just saying then, kind of like the avoidance or the always wanting to be perfect and getting things perfect before they take action. So there are some similarities there, but I think getting to know for each individual staff member what is happening for them. And then I think having those honest conversations. So I always use the expression of leaning into it rather than
Hmm.
out. Having that, as responsibility as leaders to take that proactive approach and kind of leaning in and having those honest conversations about how are you, and asking people how they are. And I think with doing what I call deeper listening, so
Mhm.
when people naturally say, like we do, don't we? I say, how are you? You're going to say, or I'm going to say, yeah, I'm fine. How are you? We
Yeah.
kind of do that, don't we? So actually asking again. So really asking those deeper questions. What's happening? How are you? And showing that care and compassion for staff. And sometimes it's what people don't say. And what
Right.
I mean by that is kind of understanding like body language,
Yes.
learning what's being communicated through not just the words people are saying, because often people will need encouragement to be so honest, but
Hmm.
actually what's the body language saying? What is your intuition saying? What are you picking up? And not being afraid to follow what you're noticing in a curious, compassionate way.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
incredibly important. From a startup perspective,
Mm.
you've got to be really curious as a leader, and lead it because there's so much treasure in your team. I think
Yeah.
collective decision making is a fantastic way to make decisions. I mean, don't get me wrong, decisions have to be made, but where
Mm.
people believe that they're part of that decision making process, again, it builds trust. From a culture perspective, I think as well, culture flows down. So, if the top of the team aren't demonstrating what you've just shared there, if the CEO and COO, CFO, if they're not demonstrating those behaviors, it can have a
Mm.
huge impact on the culture within a business. It might not seem the best of analogies, but I always think of culture a bit like if you had, say, several people in a jacuzzi together,
Mhm.
the culture is the water around them. So
Yes.
if somebody was to, say, soil that water, everybody's going to get out. They're not going to like
Yes.
being in that water in the first place. And you might not necessarily see it, but it's there. The water's there, and it's the same with culture. That
Mm.
feeling that people have, if they're going to work on a Monday morning, if they're not feeling too comfortable about it on the Sunday, usually that suggests to me that there's an aspect of the culture that needs to be developed within that business. And
Yes.
I think it's really useful for people, business leaders, to use some of those methods that you've shared there to try and build a healthier team environment, a healthier culture within an organization.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's something there where it takes courage to build a healthy culture,
Yeah.
because it takes courage to deviate from like that outdated, unhealthy system that sometimes still exists. So it takes courage for business leaders to actually take a proactive approach, put the people at the forefront, ask what they need, and see how you can support them.
Right then, folks. So if you found today's podcast interesting, Sarah and I, are going to do a part two where HR meets psychology, the overlap nobody talks about. If you're interested in getting in touch with either myself or Sarah, you can contact myself through my LinkedIn and the link will be within the podcast. What about yourself, Sarah? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
People can connect with me through my website, so sarahetoombs.com. Maybe you could link that as well,
Yeah.
or my social media, LinkedIn or my Instagram account. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, well, it's been great to have you on the podcast and look forward to part two.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for listening.